Okay, welcome back. We're going to spend some time today taking a look at how rules can inform settlement patterns. And we're going to start by looking at what are known as informalities. Informalities is a name given to what we sometimes call slums. But the term informalities refers more to the fact that these are not part of the structured built environment, but instead are arising from the bottom up local people who are responsible for putting together their own settlement environments. So a couple of statistics just to start off. By 2050, 30% of the world's population is expected to be living in informal settlements. So one of the areas of research into complexity is looking at these informal regions and realizing that self-organization isn't something that we can think of as just being an optional thing that we can opt into or not opt into. It's a fact. There are vast areas of the world where people are self-organizing in order to create their own living environment. Governments simply cannot keep up and cope with building in the formal housing sector. And so this becomes the default mode for people who have to construct by themselves. So then the question becomes, well, where are best practices occurring? What can we learn from these best practices? And is there something that the formal construction economy can learn from these informal settlement patterns? So I'm not going to talk about this particular project too much, but one of the links that you have in the website is to a video about Torre David. And Torre David is a vertical slum or a vertical informal settlement located in Venezuela. And it is a very interesting example of people who occupied a building that had been abandoned mid-construction because of financing issues. The building shell was left empty and people moved in and began to create their own structure within this informal environment. But they had to organize for themselves. There was no sort of top-down structuring system of how to live there, how to negotiate through conflicts, how to provide resources for the building, how to provide electricity. And people had to figure this out for themselves. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, because people are smart, they can figure things out for themselves, they were able to achieve a very sort of positive settlement pattern within this vertical informality. So please watch the video after the lecture and just familiarize yourself with this particular precedent. So that is an example of a contemporary informality. We want to take a look as well at some of the more historic precedents for this. And probably the first very popular publication that really emphasized the power of informal environments was this book called Architecture Without Architects, written by Bernard Brodowski. And this one really highlighted the fact that instead of this kind of environment being seen as maybe more primitive or less than what we produce within Western contexts, that some of these informal settlements are really, really tuned to their condition. They're tuned to issues around resilience, sustainability, and that maybe we can be learning something about these informal practices that can inform our own environments. What I want to point out to you with this slide here is also that we see this kind of physical unity in this environment, and that's not coming from a kind of top-down master plan blueprint. It's simply coming from the local practices within that context, and this understanding people have of the sort of tacit, I'm going to call them tacit rules of construction. What I mean by tacit rules is that these are not necessarily codified in a building code and a set of regulations, but instead it's just that everyone in that environment, through being in the place, seeing people constructing things, inheriting traditions, having the same body of tools, they all understand that this is the way that you build within this particular environment. And people don't violate those rules of building, they adhere to them as part of that larger community consciousness of how to build. And so we see another example of these tacit rules in a different context, but still very much in alignment with the the local building materials, the local climate, the local soil conditions, and also the kinds of mechanisms that community has built as a cultural practice for how to put things together. So the particular way of building the roof construction becomes a way of doing things, a way of knowledge that's passed on from family to family, from father to son, and so forth. And then we see from this a kind of unity that arises, and yet there are still tiny local variations that are occurring as people make modifications slightly tuned to their personal conditions, the size of their family, other constraints that they might have, different slight changes in topography. So everyone is responding a little bit to that situation that they find themselves in personally, but there's this kind of overall guidance that is occurring. I want to relate this back to the assignment that you have on producing a generative drawing. We can look at this particular settlement, collective settlement building, and this is in Tunisia, and see how we have both this sort of sense that there are certain rules of the game in terms of how people are building, but then there's this insertion of randomness. And in this case, the randomness isn't coming from an arbitrary toss of a dice, it's coming from individuals' personal random situations in their lives that make their context different from the context of someone else who's living next door to them that might have another series of random features in their lives that result in their needing to build slightly differently. But we are getting this sense of there being both a kind of unity and a sense of slight personalization, slight variety. The next example is, and this is an amazing place to visit if you ever get the opportunity. I went to Cappadocia, Turkey, when my son was 13, and he just loved exploring these incredible labyrinths of underground cities. These were initially built for defensive purposes, and some of them go 7 to 9 stories underground, and it's these incredible network of tunnels and rooms that connect together to create this incredible huge cities that are completely built underground. And you can think about how in building these cities, again, no one has sort of a master plan idea of how to build them. Instead, you're sort of reacting to the situation at hand. So you're moving through underground, you're perhaps, one area of the stone is softer or harder, easier to excavate, less easy to excavate. And so you're in a constant kind of dialogue within the environment, in a responsive dialogue. And you are making decisions based on new information you're receiving. Maybe you feel also that your personal situation is changing. So perhaps you build a room to store a number of vats that are holding oil. And then you realize, oh, you need more storage space because the community is enlarging. So there's a sense that the architecture can expand, can accommodate these new kinds of scenarios that you can keep building on and extending and responding, as opposed to being locked into a particular plan. And it's interesting to speculate about what that could mean for us as designers. What would it mean to be able to build with that kind of inherent possibility that if you need a new room, you just add it on? There are a lot of cave hotels that you can stay in Cappadocia. And if they wind up being successful, then they just dig out a new room. So it's sort of like you don't have to start off knowing what your hotel capacity is going to be. You can start off small and then incrementally grow bigger and bigger as you become more and more successful, and just keep excavating. And that process of excavation is simple and straightforward enough that you don't have to have a lot of capital investment in order to be able to make these changes. So there's an incredible sense of it being very nimble, very flexible. And then this is just sort of some mappings of the underground cities. And people are still trying to understand what some of the rules are of how these incredible complexes were built. But there are some of the constraints that we know of is that there are constraints surrounding the actual structure of the ground. These spaces are carved out of a soft stone called tapa that is left by volcanic deposits. And so some of that is operating as a constraint. Then there's locations of wells and air shafts, which also constrained proximity to rooms for human habitation versus rooms for storage, obviously. They built these large vertical air shafts, and so you'd want to be closer to those if it was for human habitation, and they could be further away if it was for storage of materials. There were defensive concerns, so if someone was able to come into a tunnel, they also built tunnels over top of tunnels in order to be able to pour hot oil down onto invaders. So there was a whole series of constraints of where you would place things based on partially what had come before, and then once those kind of decisions were made, where to put an air shaft, where to put a well, those things began to constrain further moves within the set. And then again, location of collective versus private spaces, how those things were organized, becomes sort of some of these tacit rules of you might have clusters of more individual rooms versus large gathering spaces. They had churches underground. They had all kinds of cooking spaces, collective spaces. It's a really interesting complex to visit if you get a chance. And then just moving to another part of the world in Australia, and I haven't visited or know too much about this example, but it came up a couple of years ago in a presentation I saw, and it was just talking about how there are the way this tribe settles is based on some cultural norms about how close you're going to be to your neighbors as a family unit, and that people don't violate those cultural norms, that they keep their distance. There's a kind of clustering, but then at the same time a kind of distance. So when we're talking about these rules of settlement, they can be imposed from we can think of building codes that are very sort of hard regulations, but then they can also just be these normative values that people decide are something that they don't want to break the norms of their culture. The other thing is that they can be absolute rules or relational rules, and we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about fractals, that you can have things that are very, very prescriptive, or you can say, well, you can do this if your neighbor I'll give a specific example. So one of the readings that you have talks about Mediterranean settlements and where you can place a window. And where you can place a window or a door relates to the windows and doors that have come before you. So you never want to be looking into someone else's window. So depending on the first people who have settled on the street, their placement of windows then constrains what the next people who build on the street, what they can do in terms of their window placement. And those are relational rules. They relate to what has happened before. Either way, they can lead to emergent or unplanned outcomes. So you have these sort of implicit rules, and then because everyone is following these implicit rules and there's feedback happening between people all following the rules, you can get a kind of an unplanned outcome that feels like, well, there's some kind of pattern that emerges that feels larger than the individual actions. And sometimes these emergent unplanned outcomes are positive or good, and sometimes they're negative. So there's no real value judgment here about emergence. Emergence can be bad. We'll look at a few bad examples. But what is interesting is that it's something that seems to transcend the individual decision-making. Another example, going to Turkey, I've spent a fair amount of time in Turkey, so I'm interested in these particular precedents, but there are precedents all around the world, is this these areas called Gecekondu. Gecekondu literally translates to night settled. There's an old Ottoman law on land tenure rights that says if you can build your house overnight, then you are allowed to stay there. So people would build illegally on land, but somehow with an Ottoman law, this is somewhat sanctioned. So in the 1980s, half of the residents in Istanbul lived in Gecekondu. And this was important that this be permitted because there were a lot of, Istanbul was booming. There were a lot of job opportunities there compared to in the rural areas, but the government could not keep up in terms of building formal settlements. So building informal settlements actually was advantageous because it meant that the workforce needed to be there could be housed, and the economy could keep moving. The way Gejekundu were often structured is that people would come from one village and then settle a particular area with other members of their village. So sometimes in Istanbul, you'll have this almost a microcosm of Turkey where all the different villages have their own particular neighborhoods associated with the migrant population into Istanbul. So here, there's knowledge that's passed on from person to person about how to construct within these Gecekundu environments. Today, they are increasingly under danger of these communities being disrupted because of land speculation, developers wanting to come in, raise these informal settlements to the ground, and then build up more profit-driven settlements that they can then rent to or sell to the people who currently are living there and feel like they at least own their own property. And if they make improvements to it, then it's theirs. They can keep it. So this is very problematic. The way the Gecekundu proceed, and one of the things that's surprising about them is that if you look at them, you wouldn't imagine necessarily that these are the product of informalities, because it's a very sophisticated system. People build initially sort of just using bare exposed building brick blocks that are relatively easy to assemble. They leave the rebar sticking out overhead at the top of the buildings for a couple of reasons. One is so that they can add multiple stories. The other is because as long as rebar is sticking out, it shows that the building is still under construction, which means it falls into a different taxation category. And you can see on this side, you have two versions, two sort of stages in the Gecekundu development. So an earlier stage where it's just 2 stories, where there's no stucco exterior yet, and then a later stage where on the left-hand side, we have the house has a stucco plaster coating on the outside, it's painted, the upper stories have been built, and so it becomes a much more finished looking product. And so as you gather money, you're able to increasingly improve your property over time in these iterative phases. And so the image that we see here, which may look like it has been a formally built neighborhood, is actually an emergent informal neighborhood that does its job in terms of accommodating people. There are issues around building technologies and safety. In earthquakes in particular, there's been a lot of disasters with poorly constructed homes. But you nonetheless sort of see an environment that is actually relatively, if you're walking in the streets of Istanbul, it's quite pleasant. The houses are working for people there, and it's not coming from the top down, yet there is a kind of a sense of unity within the neighborhoods. So, I want to talk a little bit more about iterative emergence and some of the kinds of patterns that we see. The image at the top of the slide is a view from above of an informal settlement, and you see the roads that are carved in between the houses. And the image of below is the cracks in mud as it's drying. And of course, what's interesting as well, there's somehow there's a very similar patterning in the image above and the image below. So how can you have, is this just a coincidence that these images look the same? Or are there some dynamics that are at play that are consistent between the settlement patterns and the mud crack patterns? Is there some kind of underlying piece that leads this to happen? I should mention, of course, with the mud crack patterns that there again is no top-down force that's creating that structure in the mud. It is emerging because of the dynamics of the mud baking in the sun and cracking. And if you look at it, I think you'll see that it's kind of following this fractal structure that we were talking about, in that if you zoom in on any of those areas, you begin to see smaller cracks that are very similar in structure to the larger cracks that we see. So the dynamics that we're going to talk about